coming out next week-ish about school reopenings. Because it's starting to dawn on people that this is an issue. Yes, that's probably enough.
I thought the last reports on the UK was that the treatment of the COVID crisis was a disaster, and now it's deemed a success. That's just from the newspapers.
So that's the thing, that the population is so inward-looking and naive that they haven't really accepted the narrative of disaster. But I'm a comparative politics person, so yes, it's an unmitigated disaster. But when you interview people on the street, they wouldn't tell you that. So it's a very odd, that's why I mean, the naivete of the population is a resource, if you will. Now I'm going to go to another question. I'll let you all dwell on that because it sounds very unusual, right?
Interject a note of surprise.
A surprise?
Can I interject a note of surprise?
Please do. I mean, I'm surprised as well.
I thought we were going to discuss this book.
Oh, I can't say. Oh, good. Yes, France. Yes. So let's go to some.
I thought that was the purpose of this discussion. I don't mind talking about COVID-19, but then I'm just talking as a newspaper reader. This is not my expertise at all. So
all right. So let's go back to the historical angle. I think that Roberto had brought up this book, so I'll turn to him.
Well, Alexia Michelle Arauja Rodriguez has a question.
Okay, good.
Could we say that rationalism based on theory and egoism theory is conforming in the middle of the COVID crisis?
Well, it's interesting because, as you all know, wearing a mask is not mandated out of self-interest, but out of altruism. So it shows really the strength of people's altruism. And obviously there is some altruism out there since, but not maybe as much as you might think, because now, especially when wearing a mask is mandatory, you can be stopped and harassed, perhaps even arrested for not wearing one. Then it becomes self-interest to wear a mask, not altruism. But I think in the beginning, it was really seen as voluntary acts of altruism that wouldn't benefit the person who was wearing the mask, but preventing others from getting infected. So that shows, I think, how moral norms might mutate into social norms very quickly, to use the metaphor of the day. Now, rationality has to do with rational belief formation. In a situation of uncertainty, there's no way you can form rational beliefs about anything. Then you just have to, then what takes over, as Keynes said, is animal spirits. People have to do something, and they do something. It's neither rational nor irrational.
Okay. We have a comment from Edwin Bigot from the UK. The loading of the government's vaccine ruling reflects the recent base in face of a terrible handling of early stages of the pandemic and looking for a big bright in post-Brexit Britain. Maria Safon has, please.
Hi, Maria Paula, are you there?
I'm here. How are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you, Maria Paula. My old friends.
So I have I have a question about history. So you are a self-declared methodological individualist, but you often talk about structural causes as well. Could you tell us about, well, at least in transitional justice, distributive justice issues? What are your thoughts about the relation between the macro level and the micro? And how did you think about that relation in the book, in the recent book?
Well,
if there's any, or have you completely abandoned the notion of structural?
Out there, there's only micro, but micro is too difficult because of ignorance. So we have to talk as if there is a macro. That's just inevitable. We have to talk as if states can act as if firms can act, as if household can act, as if classes can act. They can't, of course, because they're not agents. But we can't get information, except in very rare cases, about what's going on with individual persons in real time or over time. So that's why, as I said, everything out is micro. Sometimes we have to talk as if there's also a macro, but always being aware of the goal, which is to go from the macro to the micro as far as possible. So it's not really a theory, but it's just something I urge my students to look for, individual motives. And sometimes in privileged cases, and sometimes in my book, I found that I could say something about motives at the micro level. But mostly I had to impute motives from behavior, which is a very tricky, dangerous business, has to be done carefully with lots of triangulations, but it's not impossible.
I see a related question in the chat. I've now turned to the chat to kind of follow a bit more. So this is from Alexia Michelle Arroyo. I think it gets cut off.
Said that one. We already said that one. Sorry.
Yeah. All right, good. Sorry about that. See, this is one reason. We also have a question from Edgardo. Do you want to ask your question on?
I wanted to jump in on something I think you said earlier about the terrible way in which the British government handled the crisis. Well, when the accounts are being drawn up afterwards, one has to make very, 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 very careful to make sure that these errors were errors at the time, in light of available information at the time. And I think very often one will see that decisions had to be made quickly and on the basis of very incomplete information. So from the fact that later that some of them turn out to be mistaken or even disastrous, should not be seen as criticism of the decisions at the time. I think this it's very tempting to do so, but I see in Norway clearly I can follow this from day to day here. I didn't follow it from day to day or from hour to hour in Great Britain, but in Norway I followed it very closely, and it's obvious that there were a zillion experts out there with opposite opinions. Some of them proved to be right, and then they would claim afterwards, oh yes, I was right, but that was just luck.
I think what we're seeing is a difference between March 2020. Then if you make the same decisions in March 2021, this is the problem. And,
that's not right.
So this is a question from Edgardo. I don't know if I see Edgardo, so I can, yes, great. Do you want to ask
here,
it?
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jonel, sir, for your time. I'm very glad to be here with you. My question is not related to COVID and the pandemic situation. It's about Marxism. In Making Sense of Marx, in your book, Making Sense of Marx, you said that after the publication of Gerald Cohen's Karl Marx Theory of History, A Defense, the only viable future for Marxism was analytical Marxism, if Marxism had any future at all. So I want to ask you first, if you still think that Marx or the work of Marx has something to say about our actual reality, about the 21st century reality. And second, if you also still think that analytical Marxism is the only viable future for Marxism, if Marxism has a future in the 21st century. So that will be my question.
The answer is no to both questions. So Analytical Marxism was the name of the Analytical Marxist group was the name of a group that met regularly from the late 70s and actually is still meeting, but not with me. And what I can best characterize the activities of the group was the meetings and the publications that came out of them were acts of collective auto-cannibalism. That is, we collectively destroyed all the main tenets of Marxism by critical analytical work until there was nothing left. So there's nothing left. So said collective auto or self-cannibalism. So Marxism today should be treated with the historical interest that we can discuss Pierre Proudhon, historical interesting figure, but there's no Proudhonism that applies to the present world, nor is there any Marxism that applies to present phenomena. With one big exception, I've been teaching Marx regularly at Columbia, and each time it strikes me that the young Marx is so much more interesting than the mature Marx of Das Kapital, and mainly because of his emphasis on self-realization as a good life for human beings. So that was what he wrote when he was 26, and then later on, as he became mature and scientific, I think the faults of the autodidact come through so massively that it's not really no point in reading him.
Yep, go on.
I have a questions. One question. Currently, there is in Chile and South Sudan constitutional process that design institutions there. In Chile was a big referendum about they are going to have a constitutional moment. What advice would you give to Chileans and South Sudans currently that they are making these institutions and this constitutional arrangement in the middle of a pandemic? And how do you think that the current moment will affect the result of the design of these new institutions and arrangements?
Well, I'll take the occasion to comment on something Roberto Cabrera said in his introduction that I've been criticizing myself. And this applies in particular to constitution making, because in my first work on constitution making, and in fact, I mentioned this today as well, I imagine constitution making as a process where people in a calm and deliberate situation, shielded from influence and crowds and private interests and so on, sit down and reflect on how to harness or tame the interests and passions of future generations. Now, no constitution making process has ever been like that. On the contrary, to use an analogy from, well, Hayek uses the analogy that constitutions are written by Peter when sober to control Peter when drunk. But that's a wrong analogy, because Peter is drunk when he's writing a constitution. Constitutions are written in times of crisis, and only in times of crisis. Because to write a constitution, the agents have to be able to overcome short-term partisan and petty interests that prevent radical changes in politics as usual. So constitutions are written in times of crisis. That means there are lots of emotion, a lot of faulty thinking going on, but nevertheless, that's how constitutions can be made. I'm not sure whether that was actually an answer to your question, but it was a reflection on something you said in your introduction.
Well, I mean, at least you give a guide to my question. Thank you so much.
Sure. About Chile, I think in Chile, I used to teach the constitution, the Pinochet constitution, because it struck me as a very interesting case of a constitution that was written for the purpose of preventing its amendment. It was written as a sort of machine that could go on forever without being unamendable, because the military and other sort of groups were given such a key role in a system that it basically was perpetuating itself and was immune to amendment. So this is a long time ago since I taught it, but I did teach constitution making using the Chilean Constitution as an example of an attempt to create a constitution that looked sort of liberal and democratic on its face, but nevertheless had these self-immunizing or self-protecting features that hid a dictatorship behind the democratic phraseology. But that's a long time ago, and I'll follow the current events.
We do, in fact, have a question from Gabriel Negreto. He's contacted me in the chat. Are you here and able to unmute? It's about the Chilean Constitution.
Gabriel, are you there, Gabriel?
Hi, Jon. How are you doing? Nice to see you.
Sure. How are you?
Yeah, I'm in Chile actually, and as you can imagine, I am involved now in the constitution making process in different issues related to it. I have a theoretical question actually, but that is anchored in what is going on in Chile. There has been not much discussion, I believe, about decision-making rules in conventions. So usually, you know, conventions have made decisions by majority rule. In general, I would say absolute majority, not just simple majority. But there is also, you know, several cases of qualified majority, 2/3, 3/5, you know. There has been a huge discussion here in Chile because in the agreement of November 2015, it was agreed that the constitution will be passed by 2/3 majority of the whole membership, which is a high threshold. So many people have criticized this. It's, you know, basically because it kind of continues the minority veto that characterized the Pinochet constitution. But I think that there is no much solid justification for the use of even absolute majority in constitutional conventions, because I think that the usual justification for the use of majority rule is that conventions are sort of incarnations of the constituent power of the people, as if the people were deciding in a referendum, in which I agree. I mean, majority rule should be the decision-making rule. But in a convention, and in most contemporary conventions, what you have is that representation is organized by political forces. Therefore, it's not the people themselves who are making decisions. So if so, you know, qualified majority could be justified in the sense, in two senses, I would say. And I would like to know what is your take on this. In two senses. One, pragmatic, because qualified majority will prevent or will reduce the probability of partisan self-dealing. That is a partisan majority or a majority coalition, you know, using majority rule just to redistribute power in its own on its own behalf. But also from and also will induce consensus. But on the other hand, and from a more normative point of view, I think there is more sense in using some sort of complex majority rule in amendments than in the creation of new constitutions, because then for the creation of a new constitution, you know, from all, you know, theories like Locke and Hobbes, you know, the idea that when you create a new constitution, unanimity makes a lot of sense because you want to reduce the number of people that are not satisfied with the basic frame of laws to which they will be subject. And that will happen more at the time of creating a new constitution than at the time of amending an existing constitution. So that will add up to a justification for the use of qualified majority at the time of the enactment of a new constitution, more than in the case of amendment. But I don't know what, I mean, I would like to know what is your take on this. I have another question, but this is long enough.
Well, I've written, as I'm sure you know, Gabriel, because you know my work pretty well, that constitutions are almost always adopted with simple or maybe absolute, but let's say simple majority. And I usually cite the South African constitution as the main exception. And I think that probably was mistaken because I had my empirical basis was too limited. But there was a theoretical reason for thinking that this would happen, because often there's no default basis. You can have a qualified majority, and if that qualified majority is not reached, then existing constitution will just have to persist. So there's a default option. But it's like, think for instance, adopting the budget in the assembly. Adopting the budget has to be done by simple majority because there is no default option. And similarly, on the basis of the constitution making processes I knew, I thought that many of the cases, at least, not all, but many of the cases, there was no default option at all. And therefore, it had to be simple majority because otherwise there might not have been any adoption of a constitution if you required qualified majority. Now, I think unanimity is there's a school of thought, Buchanan Turlock school of thought, that you know, that thinks that the basic rules should be adopted unanimously, and then later ordinary legislation should be adopted by simple majority. But I think constitution will never be adopted unanimously. That seems to me, or if it were, it would mean that it was a sham constitution written under duress, as in the previous Soviet republics that adopted constitutions unanimously because they didn't matter. When constitutions matter, there will always be conflicts and never unanimity. I think that's as close to a law as you can get in the social sciences. But there's another issue, which is the following: that there's no super authority that can impose on a constituent assembly which decision-making rules to adopt. They will do whatever they want to do, and because that's how they see themselves as sovereign, as a constituent power. To, in your phrase, which I think is a metaphysical, meaningless absurdity, but let's leave it at that. But constituent assemblies do whatever they want to do, and they are not going to listen to. And it's, but I think in some of the cases you discussed, that we have discussed recently in Latin America, it's a bit more complicated. But since I don't know much about Latin American politics, and since my memory is not what it never was, I can't really bring to mind the details. But I think we had an exchange about this, didn't we, in our volume?
Yes,
on this, about this very issue.
Yes.
I'm sort of rambling here. That just reflects my ignorance or my lack of focus in my thinking. But I do think that unanimity is a will o' the wisp, never going to happen. So there's no point in discussing whether it should happen, because it never will. And I think simple majority is often going to be the only option, because if you don't have a viable constitution, then you have to use simple majority, because there's no fallback position and no plan B, as there could be if you have a sort of working, but not working very well, but sort of working constitution. You can keep the existing constitution unless you reach a qualified majority for a new one. So I think that's all I had to say.
Yes, you can have a follow-up.
Something on this to follow up. No, you're absolutely right. Of course, I mean, that's the trap here in Chile, because if the convention does not reach the 2/3, the existing constitution will not continue, at least not in the parts that were not approved by 2/3, which creates a huge problem, because of course you need to have constitutional justice. You need to have a budget process. So what if there is no agreement about these essential parts of the constitution? And nobody knows now, so nobody has even started to discuss the rules of the convention, and this is going to be a major problem. Now, so you're right, from a pragmatic point of view, or from the point of view of the default option, using majority rule, it's more effective, definitely. But yes, there are many processes, particularly recent ones, like Tunisia, for instance, in 2014, that used 2/3 majorities, and some observers, analysts have argued that 2/3 majority was an important inducement for reconciliation and consensus and agreement between the Islamist groups and secularists, that if majority rule would have been applied, the convention would have been completely polarized and it would have failed in the end. So, I think there are several dimensions of this question about decision making at the convention level, but certainly the default option is
from a purely logical point of view, once the convention is sitting and it's going to discuss the majority with which it will adopt the constitution, by what decision procedure will it adopt those decision rules? That has to be by simple majority.
No, it's already established, and that's something particular about this process, that there was an amendment of the existing constitution that regulates many parts of the process. Actually, there are 13 articles that were added in December 2019 to the existing Pinochet's constitution. And there it is established first that the convention is not sovereign. That is, it's a constituted power, it's not a constituent power, really. And it establishes that the rules of procedure have to be adopted by 2/3. And then that the content, each norm of the constitution must also be adopted by 2/3. Now, it is not clear whether that applies in particular and in general. There are very different instances of debate. So that is up for grabs now. But basically, the idea is that both the rules of procedure and the final constitution in its content should be approved by 2/3, and supposedly the convention cannot change that.
Supposedly is the key word, because convention.
Well, supposedly, yes, supposedly in the sense that the constitution, that it would violate the constitution, but also politically speaking, there is no single force or coalition that is likely to dominate the assembly. So it is very unlikely that there will be a political force, claiming a change of the constitution or a change of the 2/3 majority to adopt absolute majority or simple majority. It's kind of unlikely politically as well. So,
thank you very much. We'll move now to a question about democracy. Fernando Oyesto. Yes. Do you want to ask your question? Are you okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning to all. Thank you, Professor John Elster, for this chat, and welcome to the UNAM. My question, it's about democracy, especially Freedom House established that in 2020 was the worst year for democracy in recent history due to the pandemic, economic crisis, and the increase of authoritarian governments. I want to ask you that if, in your perspective, is democracy in decline? And also if the relation between constitutional and democracy has been modified. I mean, do the restraints and limits and the checks and balances that the Constitution puts on power and authorities are enough, or do we need other tools to strengthen democracy, such as deliberative democracy? Like what is the future of democracy now that we are struggling and that democracy is in decline because of the pandemic, and also because the increase of these authoritarian governments that they're legitimate because they had the votes, but that they are not protecting, they are not the best exemplars that protect democracy. Thank you so much.
Well, if these questions relate to the world as a whole, 200 and something nations, I have no idea. If you're referring to Northern and Southern America and to Western and Eastern Europe, yes, there seems to be, but frankly, this is not what I do professionally. I prefer to discuss what I do professionally, because otherwise it will just be, impressions, casual impressions. And particularly, you need to define the terms very carefully. Where do you draw a dividing line? What are defining characteristics of democracy? On some definition of democracy, the thin definition by Adam Przeworski, for instance, there might be many democracies. On a thicker definition, there might be fewer democracies, and so on and so forth. So it's really, the question is too broad and too general, and also, it's not really a proper research question, in my opinion, because a research question should be about either the causes of X or the consequences of X for some interesting X, and not just counting democracies or quantifying trends.
I think we'll go back a bit to Marxism and history, and we had a follow-up question from Maria Safon. I hope, sorry if I mispronounced her name, very much apologies. A follow-up about the 18th Brumaire. She's here.
I just wanted to know what your thoughts were, because you said you thought the young Marx was valuable, but what about the 18th Brumaire? Do you think there's something to it, or we should also just take it as past?
Well, Marx is in his two writings on France, the class struggles in France in 18th Brumaire, basically thought that every defeat of the working class was a necessary step towards his ultimate victory. So he's a very strange writing of history. I think there are brilliant passages in the 18th Brumaire, his comments on the French peasantry and many other comments, but he had no intellectual discipline. In addition to being, as I said, a complete autodidact, he had no intellectual discipline. So he said, he interpreted everything that happened in front of his eyes in terms of his contribution to the ultimate victory of communism, including all the defeats of the working class. These were necessary defeats. So I've been teaching, I'm comparing Tocqueville and Marx on 1848. And Tocqueville approaches 1848 like an historian, looking backwards to its causes. Marx approaches 1848 revolution with the eyes of a politician, with its as Hegelian philosopher of history, looking at the revolution's contribution to the eventual victory of communism. But are there any specific parts of 18th Brumaire that you would like to?
I actually wanted to ask you about causation, because I think that both in the 18th Brumaire and in the texts on France, there's much more focus on the micro, right? And the motivations of actors and how politics plays out at the micro level. So I wanted you to know. I wanted to know what you thought about.
I wish that were true, Maria Paula, but it's not really true, because when you see, for instance, how Marx discusses how the bourgeoisie, he doesn't say the bourgeoisie lost power, but the bourgeoisie abdicated power. Now there was no act with a date or place you can name where the bourgeoisie got together and decided to abdicate power. It's meaningless, but it's just a metaphor, and it's in some cases, of course, you are right. It's very, very micro, but also the main argument of the 18th Brumaire is that Louis Napoleon was necessary because the bourgeoisie was afraid of ruling, taking political power itself, because then it would be left with a naked class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the working class. So by abdicating power to Louis Napoleon, the bourgeoisie was promoting its own interest, political interest, by economic interest, by renouncing its political interest. And this is a sheer fantasy. No such. Yeah.
No, just to jump in the, is this a change regarding what you wrote on this little book on Marxism, What is Left, no? In the last chapter, what is left of Marxism? Because there, I mean, there were quite many things about alienations and intuitions, psychology. So this is a development of that, or you keep, I mean, would you still write that chapter? Are you agreeing with that chapter, still?
Well, my first answer would be, but that's a not very polite answer, would be, who cares? But
yeah.
Well, I think probably yes, with some nuances. I think. So for instance, there's one of the aspects I mentioned that I think are valuable, that I think was mentioned earlier, is how Marx sees technical change as motivated not only by profits, but also by the class struggle. And that was something that nobody had thought of at the time, and not very many later either, until a century after. And that wasn't really a theory, because it didn't have specific models or assumptions or causal mechanisms or anything, but it's just ask a question. Technical change might not just be motivated by profit seeking, but also by the class struggle, because sometimes an innovation that could be profitable from the purely economic point of view might also galvanize workers into action, therefore cut into the capitalist profit. So capitalists might rationally not adopt profitable technologies if they might actually cut into, might not adopt technically efficient technologies if they could also lead to larger sort of strengthen the class consciousness of the working class. So this was just a question he was asking, and nobody had asked that question before. He didn't provide any answer. In fact, he did, but it was wrong. But that, so there are many things like that, I think I could cite. But there's nothing you can take. There's no toolbox where you can lift up a Marxist mechanism and use it to explain anything.
But about who cares? I mean, people like me care because it's important. I mean, you studied it so carefully, and then you say, well, I mean, some intuitions, for example, concerning alienation are still ratified or could be ratified today. Yes.
Yeah, but that's a normative issue. The good life of human beings. That's a normative issue, and it's a very important, interesting one.
But also, you wrote this text on how the world probably would be better without Freud and Marx.
Yes, I did.
So could you talk about that as well?
Yes, this was a text I wrote for a fest sheet for Philippe van Parijs, written somewhat with tongue-in-cheek, somewhat ironically, but I said, I asked, what would if Marx and Freud had never lived, would the world have been better, and would the social sciences have been better? And I said, with respect to Freud, I think the world would not have been better, and psychology would not have. Psychology would have been better, and the world would have been better without Freud. And I said, with some qualifications, same about Marx. Of course, it's very difficult to say to what extent Marx was causally responsible for what was done in his name. It's very, very difficult and perhaps impossible. But I think the social sciences, almost without exception, has suffered from the huge impact of Marxism on economics, sociology, political science, literary criticism, or whatever. So that has been an almost exclusively negative impact. So yes, I think the world would have been better off, and social sciences would have been better off if Marx and Freud had never lived. I think so, but I wouldn't really. The question is essentially meaningless. How can we possibly determine this? But this is my hunch.
I mean, counterfactuals are fun, so it's useful exercise.
Yes.
Next, I have a question from Jose Antonio Aguilar.
Sure. Where are you, Jose Antonio?
I'm here. How are you?
Oh, hi. Good to see you.
Good to see you. So you were teaching the Sin regime and the souvenirs in the early 90s. What is in your new book on France? What do you think about Tocqueville's two of his main ideas in the Sin regime? One, the idea of equality and the causal weight of equality before the revolution, in preparing the grounds for 1789. And the other one is about the shift in the balance of power between the aristocracy and the people that had already happened long time ago. Because in your new book, you put a lot of attention in constitution making. So how do you relate to Tocqueville's, these two of Tocqueville's mechanisms or explanations?
I'm sorry, Jose Antonio. In my new book, I pay zero attention to constitution making because that's going to be in volume 3.
Right. So what do you think? What do you think of Tocqueville's claims?
Well, I try to summarize his claims that I find important, and it's mainly on the level of political psychology, and because what struck me when I compared Marxist theories of the French Revolution or the Ancien Regime with Tocqueville's is that Marxist theories tend to focus on material interest, exploitation, surplus value, and so on, whereas Tocqueville focuses on emotions, and also Tocqueville had this very subtle insight in what I might call adaptive preference formation, that people just get, to put it crudely used to their oppression. And then when one bit of oppression is eliminated, all the others are felt much more acutely. That's a brilliant and wonderful and I think correct insight. So it's more at that level. I'm teaching Tocqueville, I'm teaching the Ancien Regime just this semester. I'm always marveling about the acuity and the elegance and the insights. But it's really a book about grievances. What are the origin of the grievances of the different classes? And of course, in that book, he never got around to discussing the actual revolution. He claimed that it had to happen, so he didn't really need to discuss how it happened, because he claimed to have shown that it had to happen. That's a strong claim, but he had a good record as a predictor of revolutions in his own time, so maybe we should pay attention to that. But it's there's very little dynamics in that book on the Ancien Regime. No, it is it's a map of France, and that's as I try to, similar to what I try to do myself in my own book, and draw a map of France before the revolution. And well, I don't know, Anton, exactly how to answer your question, but it's
And about equality, what about talking about equality?
Yeah, that's sort of funny, because Tocqueville refers to equality both in democracy in America and in the Ancien Regime but you see, the equality or inequality rather was one of the grievances in the Ancien Regime. Tax exemptions, for instance, was a kind of inequality that fueled resentment and eventually undermined the regime. Let's just focus my mind for a second. Well, take the example I just mentioned, that when you are exploited or oppressed, a peasant, in all possible ways, of course, that's an extremely unequal position, but level is accepted as part of the natural landscape. So it's not in itself something that makes people rebel. But once they became aware that this doesn't have to be like it is, it's not a natural landscape, it's a social man-made landscape, and it can be changed. So once change is seen as possible, then and only then do the inequalities become salient and motivating for action. So that's a central theme in the book, if that is helpful.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
It sounds to me like that's a theory of agency then.
It is
versus,
indeed.
Yeah, which then ties back to your prior work on decisions and psychology. But so there's a line there, yeah.
Methodological individualism and agency, yes. Yeah. So even Tocqueville was sometimes guilty of referring to verbs that had no subjects, intentions that had no agents, free-floating intentions and free-floating motives, but they have to be anchored in agents and in specific times and places. Otherwise, as I'm telling my students, sometimes they disagree. Tocqueville was sometimes guilty of this very disembodied view of change, but I think it has to be always grounded in agency.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense to me today, thinking about how individuals have to navigate weird situations. Roberto Gargarella had a question. And I don't see him now. I have another person who also has a question.
There. I see Roberto,
Yeah.
but maybe he doesn't hear us.
Oh, there we go. It takes a moment to unmute the mic. There you go.
No, but I already asked my question. So
okay,
no,
good.
it's okay.
We're being too efficient. And we also have
follow up.
well, I think we also need to go to Victor Castañeda.
Yeah, but I think Maria Paula has a follow-up to this precise.
Okay, sorry about that. Yep.
But it's changing to other one.
Okay.
Follow up. Sorry, I won't take much time. But I just wanted to push you on the discussion of structural causes, because I understand that you have to impute motivation and agency, but that doesn't take away the notion that there is at least an accumulation of factors, right? Or things that move all together.
Can you name, Maria Paula, name one?
Right. So thinking
name one structure. Name one structural cause.
Right. So thinking about your example in Tocqueville, right? So somebody had to lift off, the structural inequality so that people would start feeling the grievance. But that reform has multiple. I mean, there's an individual that makes the reform, right? But lifting what the reform does is it lifts something that as a whole operated. I don't know how you understand that statu quo ante, and that's what I think that Tocqueville or that we have in mind when we think about that statu quo ante in terms of structure. It's a balance of power or a relation between classes, that of course an individual changes when reform takes place, or a group changes when reform takes place. But how do we think about that? Because there's a different level of analysis, at least in Tocqueville, when thinking about that.
Well, take the tax system. The tax system was not a structure. It was a set of precedents, exceptions, interpretations that accumulated over centuries and that were more or less vaguely internalized by tax officials and by the peasantry. It was a distributed knowledge or distributed beliefs that were used as premises for action. It was not a structure in any. I never seen a structure. What do structures look like? Sorry for that rhetorical and question. But it's all that's going on is distributed states of mind, to put it crudely. Distributed states of mind that include beliefs about other beliefs, other people's beliefs. But it's all in the minds. And so that's why to call a set of such distributed beliefs a structure, I don't see how that adds to anything. You have to see how these specific beliefs led these specific agents to act the way they did. Beliefs and of course motives. So it's and if you want to call this set of distributed beliefs and motives a structure, fine. But what does that add?
I really wish that we could get then into a discussion of institutions, but we have two more people. I'm really sorry. We have two more people on the list, and we were supposed to start winding up now. But I think that we all have a lot to think about with regard to structure and agency and what institutions are as well. We have Victor Castañeda and then Alexia. I'm not sure if I see Victor.
I see him.
Oh, yeah, okay. Might take a moment to unmute.
Yes.
You were unmuted and then muted.
Okay. Thank you. I will make 3 questions very quickly. Professor Esther, you claim that constitutions tend to be made in times of crisis. But what do you think about some constitutions like the Mexican that have been reformed too many times, that in a sense they have been created or made in through the time, not only in one moment. So in a sense, they have been made in periods of relative stability. The other question is regarding rational choice theory, and in specific is this a normative concept or is a descriptive conception, the one that you have developed through your career? And the last question is, are emotions always a negative element in choice making? And I ask this because some moral theories highlight the importance of emotions to arrive to morally correct decisions. So what do you think about those topics?
I'll begin with the two last questions because they are the easiest. Rational choice theory is both normative and descriptive. It's normative in that it tends to, it aims at telling agents what to do to achieve their aims in the best, most efficient way. And it's descriptive in claiming that people do adopt this advice. So it's both normative, basically it's normative, and then it also has a descriptive explanatory component to explain behavior by stipulating as a hypothesis that people follow the normative advice. So it's both. Now, I know that there's a large school of theorists that claim that emotions give us insights that we wouldn't have without them. Now, by insight, I mean propositional insights. That is, insights can be stated in propositional form. And I have not come across very many convincing examples that emotions add insights that we wouldn't have without them, except in introspection. So for instance, I didn't quite know I could feel envious until I felt envy. So my emotional feeling of envy taught me something about myself, namely, yes, I can feel envy. So that was a propositional piece of knowledge that I learned from my emotions. But the idea that you can learn about other people or things in the world through my emotions, I think, simply is not proven. It's often stated. I don't see it demonstrated either in a lab or in the field, so I just disbelieve it. So I'm waiting for good, convincing examples that do not rely simply on introspection or self-knowledge. Now, the first issue is difficult. In the chapter of the book where both Gabriel and Roberto have chapters on constituent assemblies, I state this thesis that constitution making requires passion to succeed, and crisis, and I gave a number of examples, but they are limited, and I explicitly say they are limited to Northern America and Western Europe. I know much too little about Latin America, not to talk about Asia and Africa to generalize beyond that. But in my relatively large number of cases in North America and Europe, I think you see, the general point is so simple. I said it before, but I'll repeat it, that politics as usual is all about interest, and it's petty, partisan, short-term, and you can just see how so that I think is something that I think holds pretty much universally. Whereas, so fundamental change always has losers, and losers will also often be people in power, and the winners may be population at large, but disorganized or unorganized and powerless compared to the people in power who have something to lose by radical change. So, so basically, you need an earthquake, a crisis, an emotional episode that brings people out of their habits and creates a fusion of anger and enthusiasm, which I find time and again in constitution making episodes. That fusion of anger against the regime and enthusiasm for a cause make people able to transcend what I called, to repeat, short-term petty and partisan interest. Now, my vague idea about constitution making in Mexico is that was not, well, actually, my ideas are not only vague, they're non-existent. So let me stop there.
And we now have a question from Alexia. And then that's the last question we have. We'll turn it back to Imer after that.
Okay, fine.
Well, thank you, teacher. And my question is, it follows what Victor already asked and part of what you have already answered. And the question would be like, which would be the role that you already said, the role that emotions play in the construction of norms, but which earlier you said that moral norms precede in a way social norms. So which would be the role of emotions in moral norms, and which could be the steps or the process that you find necessary to transit from moral norms to social norms in this case? Thank you.
I'm not quite sure exactly what you said, but let me try. Well, social norms, as I define them, everything here turns on definitions, and my definition is stipulative. Other people may think of social norms as something else, but I think of social norms as behavior that is maintained not by inner motivations, but by the approbation or disapprobation of by other people. That's a social norm, whereas a moral norm is essentially independent of other people, and I can act according to moral norms even when nobody's observing me. Then there's intermediate category, which I call quasi-moral norms, which is not being observed by others, but observing how others behave. And then, for instance, seeing others cooperate in a given situation, then I might think it's only fair that I contribute too, but only if others contribute. If they don't, I won't either. So there are various forms of norms. Now, moral norms, violation of moral norms triggers anger in the observer and guilt in the violator. Violations of social norms triggers contempt in the observer and shame in the violator. So the emotional penumbra, as it were, of these norms is different, but there are. But the important thing is that social norms require this emotional machinery for their causal efficacy. Moral norms don't. Well, that's a short answer, but I could go on for a long time.
So I note that it's now 30 minutes after. We're in different time zones, so I won't add the hour. Jan Elster said he'd have to leave around this time. I just want to see, is there anything that you'd like to add in closing before we really close up the event? We've had a lot of questions arise on agency structure and the role of institutions. Anything you might want to add?
Well, I just want to add what is my advice. Read history and psychology, and read good psychologists and good historians. I'd be happy to send a list. In fact, in the last chapter of my book, Explaining Social Behavior, I do provide lists of authors to read. So
we'll have to look at those lists. I'll turn it back to Imer now.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Roberto, for presenting Professor Esther. And of course, thank you, Professor, for being with us, for sharing your time, for sharing your knowledge, and of course, for sharing your lists of readings. We have to add several to those. And so let me just give some thanks to the people who made this possible, to Alexia, to Roberto, to Victor, to Juan Antonio, Rubén, René, Edgardo. So I hope I'm not skipping anyone, but and especially to Roberto, who was the one who contacted Professor Elster and invited him to redo this chat, this question and answers that you had already in UCL. And of course, I would like to thank some of the colleagues who were also very enthusiastic of your visit. We are sad that it's not a visit here physically in Mexico, but hope soon we can rearrange that. But thank you to Jose Antonio, Roberto, Gabriel, Maria Paula, Gonzalo, and everyone else that made it possible and who have been very engaging in the discussion. So I think with this, it was the ending of our session. I think it was very productive, and we enjoyed it very much. And hope to see you soon to everyone. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And take care.
Thank you. Take care.